Hey folks, this is Rhykker with the Diablo 3 patch 2.4.3 meta update video on the best builds for all classes. We took a look at this earlier during the testing phase, and so this is a part 2 to that first video now that we're closer to the patch releasing. Blizzard announced that Season 8 ends on December 30th, and Season 9 begins January 6th. This means that patch 2.4.3 is likely to release on January 3rd. That's a Tuesday, and patches tend to release on Tuesdays. Here's a too long didn't watch version of this video. The new patch isn't looking to shake up the meta as much as it seemed like it was in our previous video now that some nerfs have gone through. Still, we are seeing a couple new viable builds, or a couple old builds as well, that have been brought to viability. In our last video, we started by talking about the Crusader, whose new item, Faithful Memory, gives a huge damage buff to Blessed Hammer. As a consequence, the Hammerdin build was performing exceptionally well, clearing greater rifts higher than 100. It was basically the same old Hammerdin build we're accustomed to, just with a Faithful Memory in the cube instead of a furnace. And in our last video, we said that we expected that there would be a nerf to Faithful Memory, and that nerf would likely be a cap on how many times you can stack that bonus. Previously, there was no cap, and basically that means if you can stack enough mob density, enough monsters together on screen, your damage buff would absolutely skyrocket. So the nerf that happened is exactly what we predicted. They put a cap on it. That cap is now 10. And this is totally reasonable, and in fact, it's necessary in order to avoid another potential Twister Wizard situation which we had in the past. Previously, there was a wizard item, it was called the Twisted Sword, and very basically, it allowed you to stack a buff indefinitely. And if you completely changed the way you played the game in order to just focus on stacking this buff, things would get absolutely out of control. Even with the buff, Hammerdins are still clearing into the Greater Rift 90s, and while this build may not beat out the Legacy of Nightmares Bombardment Crusader, the Hammerdin definitely remains viable, and the only unfortunate consequence to this nerf is that the Crusader will most likely not make its way into the 4-man meta for Season 9. With the buff uncapped, it seemed like the Hammerdin might be able to take on a DPS role within the 4-man meta, perhaps replacing the monk, the DPS monk. But it seems this may no longer be the case. And the support Crusader we saw possibly starting to emerge to replace the support Barbarian didn't amount to anything. I plan to have a build guide out on the Hammerdin soon. Next, we'll revisit the Witch Doctor. We made a build guide video about Spirit Barrage and the new Witch Doctor item that buffs that skill, the Barber. This build has been up and down throughout the PTR. It was not working as intended, the item was not working as intended, and every time Blizzard tried to fix it, something else would break. The build was way overperforming, clearing Greater Rift levels 20 higher than any other build for any other class. I expected the Barber to be nerfed, but to remain relevant. I thought we would be left with a viable build, still able to clear into the high 90s. Unfortunately, the way Blizzard fixed the issues with the Barber, it's now been completely neutered, and the build is no longer a top Witch Doctor build. So unless there's some kind of late Christmas miracle that happens before the patch goes live, it looks like the meta for Witch Doctors will not change at all going into Season 9. This also has implications for the 4-player meta. Because the Barber build was so overpowered before, it became the new best DPS option in the 4-player meta. However, this also meant that we were moving back towards 3 support meta, which is a group composition that the community largely felt was not desirable. Season 8 sees a 2 DPS, 2 support meta, which is a lot more favorable to 3 support, 1 DPS. The typical composition is 1 support Barb, 1 support Monk, 1 DPS Witch Doctor, and 1 DPS Monk. Players seem to be migrating back to the old 3 support meta when the Barber was reigning supreme. And we were actually seeing the emergence of a support wizard into this party composition. If the Barber build does in fact die, then the 4-player meta will likely remain the same as it is in Season 8, with the same old Firebat Witch Doctor in a DPS spot. That said, the 4-player meta is the most difficult to predict going from PTR, going from the test server to live. Next, we'll revisit the Demon Hunter, where we actually see some good news. No, the top build still hasn't changed. It's still going to be Legacy of Nightmares Fan of Knives. But we left off in our last video with the emergence of 2 new viable builds based on the new item, the Hellcat Waistguard, which buffs grenades. We had an Italia grenade build, as well as an Unhallowed Essence generator grenade build. Since our last video, the Marauder set has been buffed. So now there's also a viable Marauder grenades build. The buff to Marauder makes it a more powerful set than Unhallowed Essence, so the Marauder grenades build is now the number 2 Demon Hunter build. It's very similar to the old Marauder builds, but we want to combine Cluster Arrow Cluster Bombs with the Hellcat Waistguard, and we give up one of our passives for the Grenadier passive in order to squeeze out more damage, in order to buff those grenades even more. And as has been customary for the past several seasons, Demon Hunters continue to have no place in the 4-man meta, which is presumably why they have so many pets, since no humans want to play with them. Next, we'll revisit the Monk. In our last video, we discussed how the new Monk weapon, Rapid Strike, wasn't working properly. This remains the case, so that item is not making its way into the meta. However, the Monk did receive some buffs to the Inna set. This helps out with Inna's viability. I was seeing at least 2 Inna builds clearing Greater Rifts above 90. The first is just the traditional Exploding Palm Inna build, but the second was actually a generator build that combined Shenlong's, Raiment, and Inna's. Effectively, it was very similar to the Raiment Shenlong build, and pure Raiment still does seem to be performing better, but Inna's is a nice alternative. It shakes it up a bit, and I might make a build guide video on this as well in the near future, just for those who want that extra bit of diversity. So what does this mean for the Monk? Well, the Monk was already the class with the most viable builds, and this buff to Inna's gives the Monk even more options now. The support Monk remains indispensable in the 4-player meta, and with the Barber being nerfed, the DPS Monk, the Raiment Shenlong generator build, will likely continue to be a solid pick, or possibly the best pick, as a secondary DPS in the 4-player meta. With Monks having so many options going into Season 9, I think that's the class that I'm going to play this season. Even though I swore off Monks a few seasons ago when I played them for a couple seasons straight. Monks may not be the absolute best at solo Greater Rifting, but they still have very respectable clears, and are the kings of one of the things that I feel is most important in a game like Diablo: variety. Next, we'll revisit the Wizard. Last we left off, the Wizard's new item, the Mantled Heel Ring, was starting to result in the emergence of a Lightning Wizard. But it still seemed less powerful than the Firebird Archon build that we've seen for a while now. Since then, Lightning Wizards have risen in popularity tremendously on the test servers, and have cleared Greater Rifts in the 90s. But their popularity on the test servers may simply be attributed to players being sick and tired of Firebird Archon and having no real reason to push on the leaderboards on the test server with Firebird Archon. Firebird still does seem to be the most powerful, but the Lightning Wizard may be a viable alternative for those who are just fed up. What's great about the Lightning Wizard is the amount of variety that we're seeing within the Lightning Wizard builds. The base build combines Veers and Talrashas and still incorporates Archon, but the Mantled Heel Ring is indispensable. Calling it a Lightning Wizard is a bit of a misnomer because being a Talrasha build, you're in fact including multiple elements, but Lightning is the one you want to gear for. Outside of those guidelines, we see a lot of differences within the skills selected and the weapons as well. And there's not been any clear winner emerging as the best Lightning Wizard. I'll try to have a build guide up on one variant of the Lightning Wizard in the near future. In our last video, I said we saw the possibility of a support wizard emerging as a part of the 4-man meta, and this trend did in fact continue up until the Barber was neutered. So it seems that the wizard's dream of being in a party has been crushed. Since no class can replace the heal monk, and the support barbarian is pretty tough to dethrone as well. And that brings us to our final class, the Barbarian. In our last video, we spoke about how the new Barbarian item is basically useless and nothing is really changing for the Barbarian. I'm happy to report that since then, the Wrath of the Waste set has been buffed, and has made the Whirlwind Barb rise in popularity on the test server. Will it outperform the Charge Barb though, which currently reigns supreme? Likely not, but this is one step towards making Whirlwind relevant again, and it has cleared Greater Rifts in the 90s. This is quite literally the exact same old Whirlwind build, it's just more powerful now thanks to the buff, So this is good news for Barbarians who are getting bored of charge. And as we mentioned, it seems that support Barbs will retain their place in the 4-man meta. So that wraps up our overview of how things are looking moving into Season 9. Stay tuned for more videos on build guides and final patch notes. You never know if that Christmas miracle will come through. Thanks for watching. Special thanks to my Twitch and Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. Check out these other videos and subscribe to join Rhykker's Raiders to keep up with all things Diablo.